Between March 1852 and October 1853, 7 young men from Boston's most prestigious families died under circumstances the city's coroner dismissed as unfortunate accidents. What authorities never connected or chose not to was that each victim had signed a peculiar contract with Margaret Lawrence, the wealthiest widow on Beacon Hill, exactly 9 months before their deaths. The contracts promised $3,000 in exchange for services that polite society would never speak of aloud. When Dr. Samuel Whitt began treating patients in the neighborhood surrounding the Lawrence mansion, he noticed something the city's elite had worked hard to conceal: a pattern of tragedy that led directly to one of Boston's most respected families. What he discovered behind the iron gates of that estate would shake his faith in human decency and force him to choose between his medical career and his conscience. Before we continue with the story of the Lawrence family and the darkness that consumed Beacon Hill, we want to know where you are listening from. Subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what state or city you are calling home. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this to light. The truth about what happened in that mansion would remain buried for decades, hidden beneath layers of money, influence, and carefully maintained silence. But every secret, no matter how well protected, eventually finds its way into the light. Boston in 1852 stood at the height of its prosperity. The textile mills that lined the Charles River had made fortunes for families whose names adorned buildings, streets, and charitable institutions throughout the city. Beacon Hill remained the crown jewel of this prosperity, where federal-style mansions lined cobblestone streets and gas lamps burned late into the evening, casting warm light on doorways that opened only to those of proper breeding and sufficient wealth. The Lawrence mansion occupied nearly half a block on Mount Vernon Street. Its red brick facade rose 4 stories above a granite foundation that had been laid in 1798. Wrought iron fencing surrounded the property, and mature elm trees provided shade in summer and skeletal beauty in winter. The house had been built by shipping magnate Josiah Lawrence, whose fortune had grown exponentially during the Napoleonic Wars. His grandson, Thomas Lawrence, had expanded that fortune by investing heavily in the textile industry, transforming the family from merely wealthy to genuinely powerful. Thomas had died suddenly in February 1851, leaving behind his widow Margaret, and their 3 daughters, Catherine, aged 22, Elizabeth, aged 20, and Anne, aged 18. The circumstances of his death had raised some eyebrows: a fall down the grand staircase during a dinner party attended by 2 judges, a congressman, and the mayor himself. But the coroner had ruled it accidental without significant investigation. Thomas had been drinking that evening, and witnesses testified such tragedies occurred even in the finest homes. Margaret Lawrence had mourned appropriately, wearing black for the prescribed period. But those who knew her well noticed something unusual about her grief. She seemed less devastated than determined, as though her husband's death had freed her to pursue some long-delayed purpose. At 43, she remained a striking woman, tall and severe, with gray eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everyone who entered her presence. She had been born Margaret von Haussmann in Prussia, immigrating to Boston with her parents in 1827 when she was 19 years old. Her father, a professor of natural philosophy, had secured a position at Harvard, and Margaret had quickly learned the manners and speech of Boston society, though she never entirely lost the slight accent that marked her as foreign-born. The neighborhood surrounding the Lawrence estate consisted primarily of similar households, wealthy families who had made their fortunes in shipping, textiles, or banking. The streets remained quiet during the day, disturbed only by the passage of carriages and the discreet comings and goings of servants. Children from these families attended the finest schools, and daughters were groomed for advantageous marriages that would unite fortunes and preserve the social order that kept Boston's elite firmly in control. Dr. Samuel Whitt had established his practice on Charles Street in early 1852, having completed his medical training at Harvard just 6 months earlier. At 27, he was young for a physician, but his skills and dedication had earned him respect among his professors. He had chosen to practice in Beacon Hill specifically because he believed he could serve the community while also building a reputation that would eventually allow him to open a teaching hospital. His own family background was respectable but modest. His father had been a school teacher in Salem, and Samuel had worked his way through medical school by tutoring wealthier students. His practice grew slowly at first. The established families of Beacon Hill already had their preferred physicians, men who had attended their fathers and grandfathers, whose discretion was legendary, and whose loyalty was assured. But Samuel had youth on his side and a willingness to make house calls at odd hours. And gradually he began to build a patient list that included merchants, clerks, and servants from the neighborhood. It was through treating servants that Samuel first heard whispers about the Lawrence household. A maid named Bridget O'Sullivan, suffering from a fever, had come to his office in late May 1852. As he examined her and prepared a tonic, she mentioned that her mistress was looking to hire additional household staff, particularly young women willing to work in a separate wing of the mansion. "Is it a large household?" Samuel had asked, making conversation. "Larger than you might think, Doctor," Bridget had replied, her voice carrying a strange tone. "Mrs. Lawrence keeps many rooms occupied, though few ever see who occupies them." Before Samuel could inquire further, Bridget had changed the subject, asking about her prognosis and when she might return to work. But the comment stayed with him, a peculiar phrasing that suggested something more than a wealthy widow's eccentricity. The Lawrence daughters were rarely seen in public. Before their father's death, they had attended church services at Trinity Church, had been presented at appropriate social functions, and had received callers on designated afternoons. But after Thomas Lawrence's funeral, they had retreated behind the walls of the mansion and remained there. When Samuel occasionally glimpsed them through windows during his walks through the neighborhood, they appeared pale and withdrawn, moving through the house like ghosts haunting their own home. Boston society operated according to strict rules in 1852, rules that governed everything from appropriate mourning periods to acceptable topics of conversation. Women of the Lawrence daughters class were expected to marry well, produce heirs, and maintain the social position their families had worked generations to achieve. The fact that all three remained unmarried as they entered their 20s was unusual but not scandalous. Yet their father's death provided an acceptable excuse for delaying courtship, but that excuse would not last forever. The textile industry that had made the Lawrence fortune was entering a period of uncertainty. Competition from mills in Lowell and Lawrence threatened Boston's dominance, and the growing political tensions over slavery were disrupting cotton supplies from the South. Wealthy families understood that fortunes could be lost as quickly as they were made, and the preservation of wealth required constant vigilance and strategic planning. Margaret Lawrence had been raised in a different tradition than most Boston matrons. Her father's circle in Prussia had included natural philosophers, early anthropologists, and scholars interested in the scientific study of human heredity. While Boston's elite traced their bloodlines with pride, Margaret had been exposed to theories that went beyond simple genealogy. Ideas about selective breeding, about the perfectibility of the human race through careful matching of superior specimens. These theories, popular in certain European academic circles, proposed that humanity could be improved through the same principles farmers used to breed better livestock. Such ideas were not entirely foreign to America. Thomas Jefferson himself had written about the importance of a natural aristocracy. But Margaret had studied with professors who took these concepts further, who believed that systematic application of breeding principles could create a new kind of human being, superior in intelligence, health, and capability. When she had mentioned these theories to her late husband, Thomas had dismissed them as continental nonsense, unsuitable for discussion in respectable Boston society. Now, with Thomas dead and her daughters under her complete control, Margaret finally had the opportunity to test whether those theories held merit. The Lawrence fortune would not last forever, she understood. But if she could create a new generation that was genuinely superior, stronger, smarter, more capable, then her grandchildren would not merely preserve the family's position, but surpass it entirely. They would be the beginning of a new aristocracy, one based not on accumulated wealth, but on biological excellence. The first step in her plan required selecting appropriate fathers for these superior children. Margaret had spent months studying the genealogies of Boston's oldest families, tracing bloodlines back to the Mayflower and beyond, looking for patterns of longevity, intelligence, and physical robustness. She had consulted with a colleague of her father's who remained in contact through letters, a German physician named Hofmeister, who had published papers on heredity in obscure scientific journals. His advice had been clear: choose young men from families with documented histories of health and achievement, ensure they were free from inherited defects, and document the results carefully. But Margaret had no intention of allowing these young men to become permanent parts of her household. The children they sired would be raised according to her principles, educated in ways she determined, shaped into the superior beings she envisioned. The fathers were merely instruments, their purpose limited to providing the raw material. What happened to them afterward was simply a matter of practical necessity. The first young man to sign Margaret Lawrence's contract was Jonathan Lell, aged 24, third son of a textile family whose mills employed 300 workers. He had come to the mansion on a wet afternoon in March 1852, responding to a note delivered to his lodgings by a well-dressed servant. The note had been cryptic but intriguing, a business opportunity that requires discretion and offers substantial compensation. Jonathan had been shown into a parlor decorated in the French style, with wallpaper depicting pastoral scenes and furniture upholstered in deep blue velvet. Margaret Lawrence had received him alone, which was itself unusual. Respectable widows did not typically meet unmarried young men without chaperones. She had offered him brandy, which he accepted, and then she had explained her proposition with a directness that left him momentarily speechless. "I have 3 daughters," she had said, her accent lending her words a peculiar formality. "They are of marriageable age, but I do not intend to marry them in the conventional manner. I require something different. I require men of excellent breeding who will agree to spend time with my daughters under specific circumstances for a specific purpose and who will sign contracts ensuring their absolute silence about these arrangements." Jonathan had set down his brandy glass, uncertain whether he was being propositioned or offered some kind of business partnership. "I do not understand, Mrs. Lawrence. What purpose would this serve?" "I am conducting an experiment," Margaret had replied, her gray eyes fixed on his face. "I believe that careful selection of parentage can produce superior offspring. I have studied my daughter's genealogy thoroughly. I have studied your family's history as well. Your grandfather lived to 93. Your father graduated from Harvard with highest honors. Your mother's family has produced 3 generations without a single case of consumption, madness, or congenital defect. You represent excellent breeding stock." The crudeness of the comparison had made Jonathan flush. "You speak of human beings as though we were cattle." "I speak of biological reality," Margaret had said. "Farmers have understood for centuries that breeding matters. Why should humans be exempt from natural law? My daughters will bear children. Mr. Lell, The only question is whether those children will be the product of random courtship and emotional attachment or the result of careful scientific selection. She had shown him the contract then, a document drawn up by a lawyer and written in language that attempted to make the arrangement sound like a business transaction. In exchange for services rendered over a period not to exceed 3 months, Jonathan would receive $3,000, more money than most men earned in 5 years. He would be required to visit the mansion twice weekly, would be given access to one of Margaret's daughters, and would be sworn to absolute secrecy. Should he violate the terms of the contract, he would forfeit the payment and face legal action for breach of agreement. "This is immoral," Jonathan had said, but his voice lacked conviction. $3,000 could establish him in business, could free him from dependence on his family's declining fortunes. "Morality," Margaret had replied, "is what wealthy people define it to be. If I arranged marriages for my daughters according to conventional practice, trading their beauty and dowries for advantageous unions, society would applaud my wisdom. I am merely removing the pretense and applying scientific principle. My daughters will be provided for. Any children will be raised in comfort and given every advantage. You will be compensated generously for your contribution. Where is the immorality?" Jonathan had signed the contract that evening, though his hand had trembled as he put pen to paper. Margaret had assigned him to Catherine, the eldest daughter, and had established a schedule. Tuesday and Friday evenings between 7 and 10 were in a room on the 3rd floor that had been prepared for this purpose. The first time Jonathan had climbed the stairs to that 3rd-floor room, his heart had been pounding so hard he thought he might faint. Catherine had been waiting for him, dressed in a white nightgown, her face as pale as marble. She had not spoken a word to him, had not met his eyes. It had been immediately clear that she was as much a victim of her mother's scheme as he was a participant. Over the following weeks, Jonathan had learned that Catherine was not simple or slow-witted as he had first feared, but rather completely subjugated to her mother's will. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words were careful and measured. She never smiled. She never expressed any opinion about the arrangement or about anything else. She was 22 years old and had been molded into something barely human, an instrument of her mother's ambitions. By June, Catherine's pregnancy had been confirmed by a physician Margaret employed, not one of the respected doctors of Beacon Hill, but a man from South Boston whose practice catered to the poor and who asked no questions as long as he was paid. Jonathan's Tuesday and Friday visits had ended, and he had received the first installment of his payment, $1,000 in gold coins. Margaret had called him to the parlor for a final meeting. "You have fulfilled your obligation admirably," she had told him. "The remainder of your payment will be provided after the child is born, provided you maintain absolute silence about this arrangement. Should you speak of this to anyone, the consequences will be severe. I trust I make myself clear." "Perfectly clear, Mrs. Lawrence," Jonathan had replied, eager to be done with the entire affair. The money sat heavy in his pocket, and he had tried to convince himself that he had done nothing truly wrong. Catherine would have been married anyway, would have borne children anyway. What difference did it make if her mother had arranged the matter unconventionally? But the guilt had followed him. He found himself unable to look at women without thinking of Catherine's dead eyes, unable to spend the money without remembering what he had done to earn it. He had begun drinking more heavily, frequenting taverns in rougher neighborhoods where his shame was diluted by the general degradation around him. On a rainy October evening, Jonathan Lell had left a tavern near the docks and had begun walking home through streets slick with mud and horse manure. Witnesses later reported seeing him stumble. Drunk, they assumed. and fall into the path of a freight wagon carrying barrels of whale oil from the harbor. The wagon's wheels had crushed his skull. The driver, who had been employed by a shipping company with financial ties to the Lawrence textile interests, had been questioned briefly and released. Accidental death, the coroner had ruled. A tragedy, but not uncommon in a city where men frequently wandered the streets intoxicated. Margaret Lawrence had attended the funeral, standing in the back of the church, her face appropriately somber. She had sent a generous wreath of white lilies and a note of condolence to the Lell family, and then she had returned home to interview the next candidate. The pattern had repeated itself twice more. William Elbridge, descended from a family of shipbuilders, had been contracted to father a child with Elizabeth. He had completed his assignment successfully, had received his payment, and had died 3 months later when he had fallen from the roof of a building he had been inspecting as a potential real estate investment. The building belonged to a trust managed by Margaret's attorney. Henry Cunningham, whose grandfather had been governor of Massachusetts, had been paired with Anne, the youngest daughter. His death had been attributed to sudden heart failure, unusual in a man of 25, but not unheard of. The physician who had examined the body and signed the death certificate received a generous donation to his private hospital shortly thereafter. By late 1853, all 3 Lawrence daughters were pregnant and 3 young men were dead. Samuel Whitt had not set out to investigate the deaths. His practice kept him occupied, and the tragedies that befell prominent families were none of his concern. But in November 1853, he had been called to attend to a servant at the Lawrence mansion, a young woman named Mary Finnegan, who had collapsed while working in the kitchen. A butler with a face like granite had shown Samuel through the mansion's main entrance, past a foyer dominated by a massive mahogany table supporting a vase of fresh flowers, and down a hallway toward the servants' quarters in the rear of the house. As they walked, Samuel had noticed something odd. The third-floor landing had been blocked off with a locked door, and he could hear movement above, footsteps, and what sounded like a baby crying. Mrs. Lawrence maintains a private ward for family members, the butler had explained when he noticed Samuel's curious glance. It is not to be disturbed. Samuel had treated Mary Finnegan for exhaustion and malnutrition. She had been working 18-hour days and eating poorly, and he had recommended rest and better meals. As he prepared to leave, he had encountered one of the Lawrence daughters in the hallway. She had been heavily pregnant, her belly swollen beneath a loose dress, and she had stared at him with eyes that held no recognition or awareness, as though she was sleepwalking. "Miss Lawrence," Samuel had said, uncertain which daughter he was addressing. She had not responded, had simply continued walking toward the stairs with slow, measured steps. The butler had appeared immediately and had guided Samuel firmly toward the exit. "The young ladies are not receiving visitors," he had said. "I must ask you to leave now, Doctor." The encounter had troubled Samuel more than he could articulate. There had been something profoundly wrong about the woman he had seen, something that went beyond the physical discomfort of late pregnancy. She had moved like a puppet on strings, animated but not alive. He had begun asking questions carefully and discreetly. Servants talked to doctors, and Samuel had cultivated relationships with household staff throughout Beacon Hill. What he learned had disturbed him. The Lawrence daughters had been essentially imprisoned in the mansion since their father's death. They never left the house, never received visitors, never attended church or social functions. Margaret Lawrence controlled every aspect of their lives, what they ate, what they wore, when they slept. The pregnancies had been noticed by household staff, of course, but no one knew who the fathers were. Young men had visited the mansion periodically, but always after dark, always shown directly to the third floor, always departed within a few hours. "Mrs. Lawrence keeps records," one servant had whispered to Samuel during a house call. "She has ledgers where she writes down everything, measurements, observations, dates. She treats those girls like they are experiments." Samuel had wanted to dismiss this as servant gossip, but he could not shake the memory of that pregnant woman's blank stare. He had begun researching Margaret Lawrence's background and had learned about her father's academic connections, about the theories of heredity and selective breeding that had circulated in European universities during the 1820s and 1830s. He had also noticed the deaths. 3 young men from excellent families, all dead within months of each other, all under circumstances that had been ruled accidental, but that struck Samuel as suspicious. He had requested copies of the death certificates from the city registrar, a colleague from medical school who owed him a favor, and had studied them carefully. Jonathan Lell, massive head trauma from a wagon accident. But the coroner's report noted unusual bruising on his arms, consistent with being forcibly held. This detail had been mentioned in the notes, but not emphasized in the official conclusion. William Elbridge, fall from height resulting in a broken neck. But several witnesses had reported seeing him with 2 men shortly before his death, men who had not been identified or questioned. Henry Cunningham, heart failure. But the examining physician had noted needle marks on his arms, suggesting he might have been receiving injections of some kind. This detail had also been overlooked in the final report. 3 deaths, 3 young men who had all been seen entering the Lawrence mansion in the months before they died. 3 families who had accepted the official explanations without significant protest, which suggested either ignorance or deliberate silence bought with money and influence. Samuel had known then that he was looking at murder. But murder committed by someone with enough power to control coroners, policemen, and perhaps even judges. Murder that served some larger purpose he did not yet fully understand. In December 1853, Catherine Lawrence had given birth to a son. The birth had been attended by the same disreputable physician Margaret employed for all her private medical matters, and no announcement had been made to Boston society. The baby had been healthy, weighing 8 lbs, with the Lell family's distinctive dark hair and strong features. Margaret had examined the infant carefully, had measured his head circumference, had tested his reflexes, had recorded all her observations in leather-bound ledgers she kept locked in her study. The baby had passed her evaluation and had been installed in the 3rd-floor nursery, where he would be raised according to principles Margaret had developed after years of study. Elizabeth's daughter had been born in January 1854 and Anne's son in February. Both babies had been healthy, and both had been subjected to the same rigorous examination. Margaret's experiment was proceeding exactly as she had planned. But there had been a 4th pregnancy, one that had not been part of the original design. One of the young women Margaret had hired to work in the 3rd-floor nursery, a girl named Sophia Prescott, who came from a respectable but impoverished family, had caught the attention of William Elbridge during one of his visits. She had become pregnant, and though Margaret had initially been furious about this uncontrolled variable, she had decided to allow the pregnancy to continue. Sophia came from excellent bloodlines. Her family traced their ancestry to Plymouth Colony, and the child might prove useful for comparison purposes. Sophia's baby had been born in March 1854, a girl who had seemed healthy at first, but who had developed a persistent cough by her 2nd week of life. Margaret had monitored the situation carefully, had consulted her ledgers and her correspondence with Hofmeister. The cough had suggested a weakness in the lungs, a potential inherited defect that could compromise the child's long-term health. On a cold April morning, Sophia had woken to find her daughter's cradle empty. When she had frantically searched the nursery and then run, screaming through the halls, Margaret had met her with cold fury. "The child was defective," Margaret had said simply. "She has been removed." "Where is she?" "Where is my baby?" Sophia had sobbed, her voice echoing through the mansion. "That is no longer your concern. You will be paid for your time, and you will leave this household today. If you speak of this to anyone, I will ensure you are institutionalized. Do you understand me?" Sophia had understood. She had taken the money Margaret offered, $50, and had left the mansion that same morning, but she had not remained silent. Traumatized and desperate, she had gone to the only person she thought might help, the young doctor on Charles Street who had treated her once for a fever. Samuel Whitt had opened his door to find a hysterical young woman who could barely speak through her tears. When he finally understood what she was telling him, he had felt his blood turn cold. A missing baby. A woman who spoke of defects and removal with clinical detachment. A household where pregnant women were kept like breeding stock and their children evaluated like livestock. "You must go to the police," Samuel had told Sophia. "They will not listen to me," Sophia had replied, her voice breaking. "Mrs. Lawrence has money, has connections. I am no one. They will call me mad, and they will lock me away just as she threatened." Samuel had known she was right. Margaret Lawrence's influence extended throughout Boston's power structure. Any accusation made against her would be dismissed, and the accuser would face consequences. But he had also known that he could not simply ignore what he had been told. "Let me investigate," he had said quietly. "If I can find proof of what she is doing, then we can go to the authorities with evidence they cannot ignore." Sophia had agreed, though she had looked at him with little hope. Samuel had given her money for lodging and had promised to contact her within the week. That night, Samuel had begun planning how to gain access to the third floor of the Lawrence mansion, where he was certain the answers lay hidden behind locked doors. Samuel's opportunity had come sooner than expected. In late April, he had received an urgent summons to the Lawrence mansion. One of the daughters was experiencing complications following childbirth and required immediate medical attention. When Samuel arrived, the butler had shown him directly to the third floor, unlocking the door with a large brass key and leading him up a narrow staircase that smelled of milk and laudanum. The third floor had been converted into a private ward with several bedrooms connected by a central corridor and a large nursery at the far end. Anne Lawrence, the youngest daughter, had been suffering from puerperal fever. Her temperature dangerously high, her body racked with chills. Samuel had treated her with cold compresses and quinine, but he had known the prognosis was poor. Puerperal fever killed half the women it infected, and Anne was already severely weakened. As he worked, Samuel had taken careful note of his surroundings. The rooms were well appointed but sterile, more like hospital wards than family quarters. The walls had been lined with bookshelves containing medical texts and scientific journals. A desk near the window had been covered with ledgers, their pages filled with neat handwriting, dates, measurements, observations. Margaret Lawrence had supervised his treatment of Anne, standing in the corner of the room and watching everything he did with those calculating gray eyes. She had shown no maternal warmth, no concern for her daughter's suffering. She had asked only clinical questions about the fever's progression and the likelihood of survival. "If she dies," Margaret had said matter-of-factly, "the child will require a wet nurse." Samuel had been shocked by her coldness but had said nothing. As a physician, he was required to maintain professional detachment. But he had never encountered a mother so utterly devoid of feeling for her own child. While Margaret had briefly left the room to instruct a servant about boiling water, Samuel had quickly examined the ledgers on the desk. What he had seen had confirmed his worst fears. Margaret had been keeping detailed records of everything. The names of the fathers she had selected, their family genealogies going back generations, medical histories documenting longevity and cause of death for ancestors. She had recorded the dates when each young man had visited the mansion, the dates when pregnancies had been confirmed. and elaborate notes about the physical characteristics she hoped to see in the resulting children. There had been additional notations that had made Samuel's blood run cold. JL disposal completed October 14th. No complications. Disposal completed November 3rd. Method. Effective. HC disposal completed December 9th. Injection method. Successful. The ledgers had documented murder, carefully planned and executed with the clinical efficiency of a farmer culling inferior breeding stock. But even more disturbing had been the pages devoted to the children themselves. Each baby had been given a designation rather than a name. Subject A1, Catherine's son. Subject B1, Elizabeth's daughter. Subject C1, Anne's son. And Subject D1, Sophia's daughter. Margaret had recorded their weights, measurements, developmental milestones, and her assessments of their potential. For Subject D1, there had been a final entry. Persistent respiratory weakness, unsuitable for study. Removed April 3rd, 1854. Samuel had heard Margaret's footsteps returning and had quickly closed the ledger, his hands shaking. He had continued treating Anne, but his mind had been racing. He now had direct evidence of Margaret's crimes, but he had obtained it while serving as her employee, treating her daughter. Any attempt to use that information would require him to explain how he had acquired it, potentially compromising his medical ethics and his legal standing. Anne Lawrence had died 3 days later, despite Samuel's best efforts. Margaret had showed no grief at her daughter's funeral, had simply arranged for the baby to be cared for by a hired wet nurse, and had continued her work as though nothing significant had occurred. Samuel had returned to his practice, haunted by what he had seen. He had finally understood the full scope of Margaret's plan. She was attempting to create a new generation of superior humans through selective breeding, documenting the process with scientific rigor and eliminating anyone who threatened to expose her work. The young men who had fathered the children were not partners in this endeavor, but merely instruments to be discarded once they had served their purpose. But the most horrifying revelation had been the fate of the unsuitable children. Margaret was not simply conducting a breeding experiment, she was culling the results, eliminating babies who failed to meet her standards. Sophia's daughter had disappeared, and Samuel had no way to know if there had been others, previous attempts that had been quietly erased from the record. He had known then that he had to act, but he had also known the risks. Margaret Lawrence had already successfully murdered 3 men without facing consequences. She had influence over police, coroners, and city officials. If Samuel openly accused her, he would likely join Jonathan Lell, William Elbridge, and Henry Cunningham in an early grave. What happened on the night of May 15, 1854, would change everything. Samuel had been walking home late after attending to a difficult childbirth in the North End. As he had crossed Boston Common, he had noticed a figure waiting near one of the gas lamps, a woman dressed in servant's clothing, her face partially obscured by a shawl. It had been Catherine Lawrence. She had approached him slowly, glancing around to ensure they were not being watched. When she spoke, her voice had been barely above a whisper, but it had carried the desperation of someone who had finally found the courage to rebel. "Dr. Whitt, I need your help. My mother is planning to kill me." Samuel had stared at her in shock. Catherine's face, visible now in the lamplight, had been gaunt and pale, but her eyes had held a clarity he had never seen during his previous encounters with her. Why would she do that? Samuel had asked, though he had suspected he already knew the answer. "She has what she wanted from me," Catherine had said. "My son is healthy, developing according to her predictions. She has documented everything she needs. I am no longer necessary to her experiment, and I know too much. I heard her speaking with her attorney last week. They were discussing arrangements for my unfortunate illness. She is planning to poison me gradually and have it attributed to lingering complications from childbirth." Catherine had handed Samuel a small vial she had taken from her pocket. "She has been giving me this in my evening tea. I pretended to drink it tonight, but I saved it. Can you test it? Can you determine what it is?" Samuel had taken the vial, his mind reeling. If Catherine was telling the truth and he had no reason to doubt her, then Margaret was escalating her crimes, now willing to murder her own daughter to protect her secrets. "Why me?" Samuel had asked. "Why come to me instead of the police?" "Because you already suspect her," Catherine had replied. "I have seen how you look at her when you tend to patients in our house. You know something is wrong. And because you are young enough not to be in her pocket, not yet corrupted by money or fear, you are my only hope, doctor." Samuel had agreed to help her, though he had known it meant putting himself directly in Margaret Lawrence's crosshairs. He had told Catherine to pretend to drink the tea going forward, to maintain her appearance of submission while he worked to gather evidence that would be strong enough to bring Margaret to justice. The vial Catherine had given him had contained arsenic, as Samuel had confirmed through chemical testing the next morning. It had been diluted enough to avoid causing immediate dramatic symptoms, but regular doses would have eventually resulted in organ failure that could easily be attributed to natural causes, especially in a woman already weakened by childbirth. Samuel had been faced with an impossible choice. He had evidence now: the vial of poison, the testimony of Margaret's daughter, his own observations from the third floor. But was it enough? Margaret's wealth and influence might still prove insurmountable, especially if she realized she had been exposed and moved quickly to eliminate witnesses. He had needed more. He had needed proof so damning, so undeniable that even Margaret's connections could not save her. Samuel had begun his investigation by researching Margaret's background more thoroughly, traveling to Harvard to access the university's records. He had discovered that Margaret's father, Professor Klaus von Haussmann, had been dismissed from his position in 1835 under circumstances that had been carefully obscured in official records. But Samuel had found a letter in the archives written by the university president to the board of overseers that had explained the true reason for von Haussmann's dismissal. The professor had been conducting experiments on live subjects, orphans, and indigent children he had obtained from poor houses, attempting to measure inherited characteristics and test theories about the malleability of human intelligence through early intervention. When the experiments had been discovered, the university had quietly terminated his employment and had paid money to several families to ensure their silence. Von Haussmann had died shortly thereafter, but his papers and research notes had been confiscated and sealed. Samuel had petitioned the university to access those sealed papers, claiming he was conducting research on hereditary disease. After weeks of bureaucratic delay, he had finally been granted limited access to the documents. What he had found had been chilling. Von Haussmann had been obsessed with creating what he called the perfected human, individuals free from inherited defects, possessing optimal physical and mental capabilities. His writings had been filled with pseudoscientific theories about racial superiority, about the necessity of eliminating inferior stock, about the duty of those with superior breeding to reproduce selectively. He had corresponded with similar-minded academics across Europe, sharing data and refining theories that would later be recognized as deeply immoral, but which in the 1820s and 1830s had found audiences in certain intellectual circles. Among von Haussmann's papers, Samuel had found letters from his daughter Margaret written between 1845 and 1850. These letters had revealed that Margaret had not merely absorbed her father's theories. She had expanded upon them, had refined them, had waited patiently for the opportunity to put them into practice. Her marriage to Thomas Lawrence had been strategic, she had written, chosen specifically because Thomas came from a family with documented longevity and robust health. but Thomas himself had been an obstacle. His conventional morality and religious convictions made him unsuitable as a true partner in her life's work. One letter, dated November 1850, had been particularly revealing. "Father, I have concluded that Thomas must be removed. He has discovered some of my preparations and has threatened to have me institutionalized if I persist in what he calls unnatural philosophies. He does not understand that we stand on the threshold of human transformation, that the methods you pioneered can be perfected. I have secured the support of several men of influence who share our vision, men who understand that Boston's future depends on cultivating superior bloodlines. Once Thomas is gone, I will have the freedom and resources to proceed. The experiment will be my legacy to your memory." Samuel had stared at that letter for a long time, understanding finally that Thomas Lawrence's death had been no accident. Margaret had murdered her own husband to clear the way for her experiment, and she had done so with the assistance of powerful conspirators, men whose identities Samuel still needed to uncover. He had copied several of the most damning documents, working late into the night in the Harvard archives, knowing that this evidence could be suppressed or destroyed if Margaret learned of his investigation. The question now was how to use this information without putting himself and Catherine at immediate risk. The answer had come from an unexpected source. In early June 1854, Samuel had received a visitor at his practice. A lawyer named Josiah Fletcher, a man in his 60s with the careful demeanor of someone who had spent decades navigating Boston's complex social hierarchies. Fletcher had closed the door behind him and had spoken quietly. "Dr. Whitt, I represent the interests of the Lell family. I understand you have been making inquiries about the death of Jonathan Lell." Samuel's heart had begun racing. Uncertain whether this was a threat or an opportunity. "I am a physician, Mr. Fletcher. I take an interest in any death that seems inconsistent with the official explanation." "As do I," Fletcher had replied. "Jonathan's father came to me several months ago with concerns about his son's final weeks. Jonathan had been drinking heavily, yes, but he had also been terrified of something he would not name. He had come into a substantial sum of money, $3,000, but he had refused to explain its source. And in the days before his death, he had told his father that he had done something terrible, something that would haunt him forever, and that powerful people wanted to ensure his silence." Fletcher had removed a document from his leather case and had placed it on Samuel's desk. "This is Jonathan's contract with Margaret Lawrence. His father found it hidden among his papers after his death. It is carefully worded to appear innocuous, but the implications are clear. Margaret Lawrence paid Jonathan to father a child with her daughter, and then she had him killed to ensure his silence." Samuel had examined the contract, his hands trembling slightly. This was the proof he had needed, direct evidence linking Margaret to Jonathan's death, written in legal language that could not be easily dismissed. "Why bring this to me?" Samuel had asked. "Because the Lell family cannot act openly against Margaret Lawrence without destroying their own reputation," Fletcher had explained. "If it became known that Jonathan participated in this scheme, even under financial pressure, the scandal would ruin the family's standing in Boston society. But you, Doctor, have no such constraints. You have begun asking questions. You have treated members of the Lawrence household. You have legitimate cause to investigate. If you were to bring charges against Margaret Lawrence, the Lell family would support you quietly, would ensure that witnesses came forward, would use their influence to prevent the case from being suppressed." Samuel had understood then that he was being offered a partnership. The Lell family's wealth and connections, combined with his medical expertise and evidence, might be enough to overcome Margaret's power. But he had also understood the risks. "If I move against Margaret Lawrence, she will try to kill me," Samuel had said bluntly. "Yes," Fletcher had agreed. She will, which is why you must strike quickly and decisively with enough evidence to have her arrested immediately before she can retaliate. The Lell family has already contacted the families of William Elbridge and Henry Cunningham. Both have found similar contracts among their sons' effects. Both are willing to support criminal charges, provided their participation can remain confidential until Margaret is in custody. Over the following days, Samuel had worked with Fletcher to build their case, assembling evidence from multiple sources, the contracts, the letters from Margaret to her father, testimony from Catherine about the poisoning attempt, Sophia's account of her missing daughter, and Samuel's own observations from the third floor of the Lawrence mansion. But they had also discovered something that had complicated their plans. Margaret Lawrence was not working alone. While examining city records related to the deaths of Jonathan Lell and the others, Fletcher had noticed a pattern in the coroner's reports. All 3 deaths had been examined by the same coroner, a man named Virgil Danforth, who had consistently ruled them accidental, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Danforth had been appointed to his position through the influence of Judge Harrison Apprentice, one of the men who had been present at Thomas Lawrence's fatal dinner party. Further investigation had revealed that Judge Apprentice was a member of a private club called the Society for Human Advancement, founded in 1848 by several prominent Boston intellectuals who had been influenced by von Hausmann's theories. The society met monthly at a private residence on Louisburg Square, and its membership included several judges, 2 state legislators, a newspaper publisher, and the mayor's chief legal advisor. Margaret Lawrence had been corresponding with members of this society since her husband's death, and they had been providing her with protection and support for her experiment. They had seen her work as a practical application of theories they had discussed in abstract terms, a real-world test of whether selective breeding could improve the human species. In exchange for being able to observe and document her results, they had used their positions to shield her from investigation and to eliminate obstacles that threatened her work. This was not simply a case of one wealthy woman committing murder. This was a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful men in Boston, men who believed they were serving a higher purpose by allowing Margaret to continue her grotesque experiment. Just when Samuel and Fletcher had thought they understood the full scope of the conspiracy, the horror in Boston's Beacon Hill was about to intensify. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens next. The true depths of Margaret's depravity were still to be revealed. Samuel had known that exposing Margaret Lawrence would require more than documents and testimony. He would need physical evidence of her crimes, evidence so compelling that even her powerful allies could not suppress it. That meant gaining access to the third floor of the Lawrence mansion once more, this time to search thoroughly for proof of what had happened to the unsuitable children Margaret had removed from her study. His opportunity had come in late June when another urgent summons had arrived. Elizabeth Lawrence was experiencing severe abdominal pain and required immediate medical attention. Samuel had packed his medical bag and had headed to the mansion. But this time, he had been prepared to do more than simply treat a patient. Elizabeth's condition had proven to be a prolapsed uterus, a dangerous but not immediately life-threatening complication of childbirth. Samuel had been able to provide temporary relief, but he had told Margaret that Elizabeth would require ongoing treatment over several days. Margaret had agreed, and Samuel had been granted access to the third floor on a regular basis. During his third visit, while Margaret was occupied with household matters downstairs, Samuel had made his move. He had asked the attending nurse to fetch additional clean linens, giving him a few minutes alone on the third floor. He had moved quickly through the corridor, trying door handles until he had found one that was locked. a door at the far end of the hall, past the nursery where the surviving children were kept. Samuel had used a medical probe to work the lock, a skill he had learned from a locksmith patient who had been grateful for Samuel's treatment of his daughter. The lock had given way, and Samuel had slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. The room beyond had been furnished as a laboratory. Shelves lined the walls, holding glass jars containing specimens preserved in alcohol, organs, tissue samples, and specimens that had made Samuel's stomach turn. On a central table, he had found Margaret's complete research records, detailed ledgers documenting not just the 3 living children from the Lawrence daughters, but 7 previous attempts that had occurred over the past 2 years. Margaret had been conducting her experiment longer than anyone had realized. Before contracting with Jonathan Lell and the others, she had been testing her methods on servants and hired women, paying them to become pregnant by men Margaret had selected, then taking the babies after birth. Of the 7 children from these preliminary trials, only 2 had met Margaret's standards. The other 5 had been classified as unsuitable and had been removed. Samuel had found detailed notes describing the grounds for each rejection. Subject E1 had shown signs of developmental delay at 6 months. Subject F1 had contracted whooping cough and had been deemed constitutionally weak. Subject G1 had possessed what Margaret described as unfortunate facial asymmetry, suggesting inferior bloodline despite careful selection. But what had truly horrified Samuel was what he had found in the preservation jars. Margaret had not simply removed the unsuitable children. She had been conducting autopsies on them, dissecting their organs, documenting her findings with scientific precision. She had been attempting to identify physical markers of inferiority that could be detected earlier so that future subjects could be eliminated before significant resources were invested in their care. The children had been killed, suffocated, Samuel had determined from Margaret's clinical descriptions, and then their bodies had been used as research materials. Margaret had been treating human infants like laboratory specimens, with no more moral consideration than a scientist might give to dissecting a frog. Samuel had been photographing the ledger pages with a small camera he had borrowed, a recent innovation that was becoming more common in medical documentation. When he had heard footsteps approaching in the hallway, he had quickly closed the ledgers, had pocketed the photographic plates, and had been examining the preservation jars more closely when the door had opened. Margaret Lawrence had stood in the doorway, her face utterly composed, showing no surprise or alarm at finding Samuel in her private laboratory. "I wondered how long it would take you," she had said calmly. "You have been asking too many questions, Dr. Whitt, making inquiries at Harvard, consulting with lawyers, treating my daughters with an unusual level of concern. I have been watching you." Samuel had felt his hand move toward his medical bag, where he had concealed a small pistol Fletcher had insisted he carry. But Margaret had smiled, a cold expression that had never reached her eyes. "There is no need for violence, Doctor. We are both civilized people. Surely we can discuss this rationally." "You have murdered children," Samuel had said, his voice shaking with rage and horror. "You have killed the fathers of your grandchildren. You have poisoned your own daughter. There is nothing rational about what you have done." "On the contrary," Margaret had replied, moving into the room and closing the door behind her. "What I have done is entirely rational. I have applied scientific principles to the improvement of the human species. Every farmer culls inferior livestock. Every gardener removes weak seedlings. Why should humans be exempt from these same principles of selection? The children I removed would have lived unremarkable lives, contributing nothing of value to society. The men I eliminated had fulfilled their purpose and had become liabilities. These were rational decisions made in service of a greater goal. And what goal could possibly justify murdering children? Samuel had demanded. The creation of a superior human line, Margaret had answered, her voice carrying the certainty of true fanaticism. In 3 generations, my descendants will be healthier, more intelligent, more capable than ordinary humans. They will be the foundation of a new aristocracy, one based not on accumulated wealth but on biological excellence. They will lead this nation into a future of unprecedented achievement. Can you not see the magnificence of this vision? Samuel had stared at her, recognizing finally that he was not dealing with simple criminality, but with genuine madness dressed in the language of science. Margaret Lawrence truly believed she was serving humanity through her monstrous actions. You will never see that future, Samuel had said. I have evidence of everything you have done. Contracts, correspondence, witness testimony. I am taking you to the authorities today. Margaret's expression had not changed. No, Dr. Whitt, you are not. Because if you attempt to expose me, I will ensure that everyone you care about suffers. Your practice will be destroyed by accusations of incompetence. Your family in Salem will face financial ruin through lawsuits, and you will be found dead, another unfortunate victim of the violence that plagues our city. I have resources you cannot imagine and allies who will protect me because they understand the importance of my work. She had moved toward him, her gray eyes fixed on his face with predatory intensity. But I am prepared to offer you an alternative. Join us, Dr. Whitt. The Society for Human Advancement could benefit from a young physician with your skills. Help us refine our methods. Document our results with medical precision. You would be part of something greater than yourself, something that will be remembered long after we are all gone. Samuel had realized with cold certainty that Margaret believed she could recruit him, could bring him into her conspiracy through a combination of threats and appeals to scientific ambition. She had done this before. He had understood, identified potential obstacles and had either eliminated them or converted them into allies. I will never help you, Samuel had said. Margaret had sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. Then you have chosen poorly, Doctor. I had hoped you would be reasonable. She had turned toward the door, clearly intending to summon assistance, to have Samuel removed from the mansion and likely killed before he could reach the authorities. But Samuel had been faster. He had grabbed his medical bag, had withdrawn the pistol, and had pointed it directly at Margaret's chest. You are coming with me to the police station, he had said. Now Margaret had looked at the weapon with curiosity rather than fear. You are a physician, Dr. Whitt. You have taken an oath to do no harm. You will not shoot me. You are correct that I will not shoot to kill, Samuel had replied. But I will gladly wound you if necessary. A bullet through your shoulder will not be fatal, but it will ensure you cannot escape while I summon the authorities. Your choice, Mrs. Lawrence. For the first time, Samuel had seen uncertainty in Margaret's face. She had calculated the odds and had realized that Samuel might actually fire. Her hand, which had been reaching for the door handle, had hesitated. But before either of them could move, the door had burst open and Catherine Lawrence had entered, breathing hard as though she had been running. In her hand, she had held a kitchen knife, its blade catching the afternoon light from the laboratory windows. Step away from my mother, Catherine had said, her voice carrying an edge Samuel had never heard before. Samuel had stared at her in confusion. Catherine, she has been poisoning you. She planned to kill you. I am trying to help. I know what she planned, Catherine had interrupted. And I know what you discovered. But you do not understand everything, Dr. Whitt. You do not understand what we have become. Margaret had smiled then, a genuine expression of satisfaction. Catherine has proven to be more adaptable than I anticipated. Tell him, my dear. Catherine had moved closer, the knife still held firmly in her hand. For months I did what my mother demanded because I was terrified. I was a prisoner in this house, forced to bear a child by a stranger, treated like livestock. But then I realized something, Doctor. My mother is correct. Not about everything, but about the fundamental principle. We live in a world that values strength over weakness, intelligence over ignorance, capability over mediocrity. My son will grow up with every advantage: wealth, education, health. He will be superior to ordinary children not because of some mystical bloodline, but because of the resources and knowledge that will be invested in his development. She has been murdering children, Samuel had said desperately. How can you possibly defend that? I have seen the children my mother removed, Catherine had replied, her voice cold. Some were sickly, some were malformed. Some showed signs of idiocy or other defects. Would it have been more merciful to let them live diminished lives, to suffer through childhood and die young anyway, or to burden families who could not properly care for them? My mother made difficult decisions, yes, but she made them based on reason and observation, not sentiment. Samuel had realized then that Margaret had not just imprisoned her daughters. She had indoctrinated them, had gradually converted them from victims into willing participants in her horrific experiment. Catherine had developed what physicians were beginning to call identification with the captor, a psychological adaptation in which prisoners came to adopt the beliefs and goals of those who held them captive. Elizabeth feels the same way, Catherine had continued, and Anne did before she died. We understand now what our mother is trying to achieve, and we will not let you destroy it. The situation had deteriorated rapidly. Samuel had been trapped in the laboratory with two women who were prepared to kill him to protect their secret, and his only weapon was a pistol he was genuinely reluctant to use. He had trained as a physician to save lives, not to take them, and the thought of shooting Catherine, even in self-defense, had been nearly unbearable. But he had also known that if he did not escape that room, he would never leave the Lawrence mansion alive. The confrontation in Margaret's laboratory had lasted only seconds, but for Samuel, time had seemed slow. Each detail burned into his memory with crystalline clarity. Catherine had been moving toward him, the kitchen knife held with surprising competence, her face set with determination. Margaret had been backing toward a cabinet on the wall where Samuel had suspected she kept additional weapons, or perhaps chemicals that could be weaponized. Samuel had made his decision in an instant. He had swung his medical bag hard at Catherine's knife hand, connecting solidly enough to make her cry out and drop the blade. Then he had lunged for the door, yanking it open and running into the corridor. Behind him, he had heard Margaret shouting for the servants, her voice sharp with command. Footsteps had thundered up the staircase. The butler and two other male servants, all of them physically larger and stronger than Samuel. Samuel had run toward the main staircase, but it had been blocked by the approaching servants. He had reversed direction, sprinting toward the back stairs that led down to the kitchen level. Behind him, he had heard Catherine screaming, "Stop him! He has stolen documents. He must not leave." The back stairs had been narrow and dark, lit only by a single gas lamp. Samuel had taken them two at a time, his medical bag bouncing against his hip, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He had emerged into the kitchen where several maids had looked up in surprise from their work. "Fire!" Samuel had shouted, the first thing that came to mind. "Fire on the third floor. Everyone out!" The panic his words created had been exactly what he needed. The maids had begun screaming and running toward the exits, creating chaos that had slowed his pursuers. Samuel had joined the exodus, bursting out through the kitchen door into the mansion's rear garden. He had run through the formal landscaping, past rose bushes and sculpted hedges, toward the iron fence that surrounded the property. Behind him, he had heard the butler shouting for the servants to split up, to cover all the exits, to ensure Samuel did not escape with stolen property. The fence had been 8 feet tall, topped with decorative spikes. Samuel had thrown his medical bag over it, hearing it land with a heavy thud on the sidewalk beyond. Then he had grabbed the iron bars and had begun climbing, his hands slipping on the painted metal, his shoes finding precarious purchase on the decorative scrollwork. He had been halfway up when someone had grabbed his ankle. Looking down, he had seen the butler pulling at his leg, trying to drag him back down. Samuel had kicked hard, his heel connecting with the man's face. The butler had stumbled backward, blood streaming from his nose, and Samuel had scrambled the rest of the way up the fence. The decorative spikes at the top had torn through his coat and had gashed his arm, but Samuel had barely felt the pain. He had thrown himself over the fence and had dropped heavily onto the sidewalk, rolling to absorb the impact. He had grabbed his medical bag and had run, his wounded arm leaving drops of blood on the pavement behind him. Behind him, he had heard Margaret's voice calling out, calm and commanding, "Let him go! Alert Judge Apprentice immediately. Dr. Whit will not reach the authorities." Samuel had run for 6 blocks before his burning lungs had forced him to slow to a walk. He had been in a residential neighborhood, late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the street. Respectable people had stared at him. His torn coat, his bleeding arm, his desperate gasping breaths, but no one had approached to help. In Boston, one did not interfere in the troubles of strangers. He had known then that going directly to the police would be suicide. Margaret would have already sent word to her allies, and any officers Samuel encountered would be looking for him, prepared to arrest him on false charges or simply make him disappear. He had needed somewhere safe, somewhere Margaret's influence could not immediately reach. He had made his way to Fletcher's law office on Court Street, checking constantly to ensure he was not being followed. Fletcher had been working late, reviewing documents by lamplight, and had looked up in alarm when Samuel had burst through his door. "Good God, what happened?" Fletcher had demanded, seeing Samuel's disheveled appearance and bleeding arm. Samuel had told him everything: the laboratory, the preserved specimens, the ledgers documenting murdered children, the confrontation with Margaret and Catherine, the desperate escape. As he spoke, Fletcher's expression had grown increasingly grave. "We must move immediately," Fletcher had said when Samuel finished. "Margaret will be mobilizing her allies even now. We have perhaps a few hours before they concoct some story that paints you as the criminal. Theft, assault, perhaps even attempting to harm the Lawrence daughters. You need to be in protective custody before they can act." "Can we trust any of the police?" Samuel had asked. "Not in Boston proper," Fletcher had replied. "But I have a contact in the Massachusetts State Police, a captain named Reginald Barnes, who has no connections to Beacon Hill society. He is an honest man who has been frustrated by the corruption he sees in the city. If we can reach him and present our evidence, he will protect you while we build the case." Fletcher had bandaged Samuel's arm, had provided him with a fresh coat, and then they had left the office through a rear entrance. They had hired a coach to take them to the state police barracks in Roxbury, a journey of several miles that felt like hours. Samuel had kept expecting to be stopped, to see Margaret's hired men blocking the road, but they had reached their destination without incident. Captain Barnes had been a square-jawed man in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years dealing with criminals. He had listened to Samuel's account with careful attention, occasionally asking pointed questions, his eyes sharp with intelligence. "These are serious accusations against very powerful people," Barnes had said when Samuel finished. "If you are lying or if your evidence is insufficient, you will be destroyed." "Are you certain about this?" "I have seen the bodies of murdered infants preserved in jars," Samuel had replied, his voice shaking with emotion. "I have read ledgers documenting their deaths. I have contracts proving that Margaret Lawrence paid men to impregnate her daughters and then had those men killed. I am absolutely certain, Barnes had nodded slowly. Then we need to move quickly. I will take a squad of men to the Lawrence mansion tonight and secure the premises. We will seize all documents and evidence before they can be destroyed. You will remain here under guard until this is resolved. But Fletcher had shaken his head. Captain, if you raid the mansion, Judge Apprentice and the others will claim you are acting without authority, will manufacture legal obstacles, will have you removed from your position. We need to go higher. We need to involve the governor. Barnes had considered this, then had nodded. Governor Clifford is in Boston this week. I can request an emergency meeting. If we can present the evidence directly to him, he can provide the authority we need to move against the conspirators, even if they include members of the judiciary. They had worked through the night organizing their evidence and preparing their presentation. Samuel had provided his photographs of the ledger pages, the contracts supplied by the Liel family, Catherine's testimony about the poisoning attempt, Sophia's account of her missing daughter, and his own detailed observations from the third floor. By dawn, they had been ready. Captain Barnes had sent a messenger to the governor's residence, requesting an urgent meeting on matters of public safety and criminal conspiracy. The response had come within an hour. Governor Clifford would see them at 8 that morning. Samuel had felt hope for the first time since escaping the Lawrence mansion. Perhaps they actually could bring Margaret and her conspirators to justice. Perhaps the evidence would be strong enough to overcome even their considerable influence. But as they had prepared to leave for the governor's residence, a messenger had arrived with news that had changed everything. The Lawrence mansion had burned during the night. The fire had been discovered around 3 in the morning, and by the time the volunteer fire brigade had arrived, the entire structure had been engulfed in flames. The fire had burned so hot and spread so quickly that nothing could be saved. The mansion had been reduced to a smoking ruin, and everyone inside, Margaret Lawrence, her 2 surviving daughters, the 3 infants, and all the household servants, had perished. Samuel had stood in the captain's office, feeling as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. All the evidence he needed had been in that mansion: the laboratory, the ledgers, the preserved specimens. And now it was gone. Destroyed in a fire so convenient it could only have been deliberately set. She burned it, Samuel had said quietly. Margaret knew we were coming for her, so she destroyed everything. She killed her own daughters and grandchildren to protect her secrets. But Fletcher had been studying the messenger's face, noting something in his expression. "What are you not telling us?" the lawyer had asked. The messenger, a young police officer, had shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, there is something strange about the fire. The bodies we have recovered, there are not enough of them. We found remains in the rubble, yes, but not as many as there should have been if everyone in the household died. And there is more," he continued. "A carriage was seen leaving the mansion around midnight, several hours before the fire started. The driver has not been located." Samuel's mind had raced. If Margaret had escaped, if she had taken the children and fled before setting the fire, then she might still be brought to justice. But where would she go? She could not remain in Boston. Too many people now knew about her crimes. She would need to disappear completely, to start over somewhere her name and face were unknown. "The docks," Fletcher had said suddenly. If she left Boston, she would go by ship. "We need to check departures from last night and this morning." Captain Barnes had immediately dispatched officers to the harbor with orders to check passenger manifests for any ships that had departed since midnight. Samuel, Fletcher, and Barnes had then proceeded to their meeting with Governor Clifford, where they had presented their evidence and explained what had happened. Governor Clifford had been a practical politician, less interested in the ethical implications of Margaret's experiment than in the political scandal it represented. You are telling me that several judges, legislators, and the mayor's own advisor have been complicit in multiple murders," he had said, his face darkening. "If this becomes public, it will destroy confidence in the entire government." Which is precisely why it must become public, Fletcher had argued. These men have betrayed the trust of the people they were sworn to serve. They must face justice. The governor had eventually agreed, but he had insisted on controlling the narrative. The investigation would proceed, but carefully, with attention to protecting the institutions even as individual criminals were prosecuted. Samuel had felt disgusted at this political calculation, but had understood the necessity. If they moved too aggressively, the conspirators might use their positions to suppress the investigation entirely. By late morning, Captain Barnes's officers had returned with significant news. A ship called the Bremen Star had departed for Hamburg at first light, carrying among its passengers a widow traveling under the name Margaret von Haussmann, accompanied by 2 adult daughters and 3 young children. The description matched the Lawrence family perfectly. "She is returning to Germany," Samuel had said, "back to her father's academic circles where her theories might find more acceptance." "Can we extradite her?" the governor had asked Barnes. "Not easily," the captain had replied. "We have no formal treaty with the German states for return of criminals. We could request her return through diplomatic channels, but it would take months, and there is no guarantee the German authorities would cooperate, especially if she has influential friends there." Samuel had felt a crushing sense of failure. Margaret Lawrence had murdered at least 12 people, 5 infants from her preliminary experiments, Sophia's daughter, 3 young men who had fathered her grandchildren, her own daughter Anne through medical neglect, her husband Thomas, and potentially numerous servants who had died in the fire. Yet she had escaped justice entirely. She would live out her life in Germany, perhaps continuing her grotesque experiments, protected by distance and the limitations of international law. But Fletcher had not given up. "Even if Margaret escapes, we can still prosecute her co-conspirators. Judge Apprentice, Coroner Danforth, the members of the Society for Human Advancement. They enabled her crimes and helped cover them up. We have the documents proving their involvement. We can ensure they face consequences even if Margaret does not." The investigation that followed had been unlike anything Boston had seen before. Governor Clifford had appointed a special prosecutor with broad authority to pursue the case wherever it led. Captain Barnes and his men had raided the Society for Human Advancement's meeting place, seizing correspondence and membership records. They had arrested Coroner Danforth, whose detailed records of his dealings with Margaret provided devastating evidence of the cover-up. Judge Apprentice had been more problematic. As a sitting judge, he could not be easily arrested, and he had immediately used his position to fight the investigation, filing legal motions and calling in favors from other members of the judiciary. But the evidence against him had been substantial. Letters he had written to Margaret offering his support, records of payments he had received to ensure favorable rulings, testimony from servants who had seen him visiting the Lawrence mansion late at night. The scandal had erupted across Boston in July 1854. Newspapers had published lurid accounts of the Beacon Hill conspiracy, though many details had been suppressed to protect the families involved. The public had been shocked to learn that some of their most respected citizens had been complicit in murder and criminal conspiracy, all in service of pseudo-scientific theories about human breeding. The trials had begun in August. Coroner Danforth, faced with overwhelming evidence, had agreed to testify against the others in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony had exposed the full extent of the conspiracy, not just the murders Margaret had committed, but also earlier crimes that had been covered up, suspicious deaths that had been ruled accidental, evidence that had been destroyed or falsified. Judge Apprentice had fought to the end, using every legal maneuver available, but his position had become untenable when 3 other members of the Society for Human Advancement had turned state's evidence. In October 1854, he had been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and had been sentenced to 20 years in prison. The trial had been sensational, drawing observers from across the country. Though many of the most disturbing details, the preserved infant bodies, the detailed breeding records, had been presented in closed sessions to protect public decency. Other members of the society had faced varying consequences. 2 legislators had resigned in disgrace. The mayor's legal advisor had been dismissed and had fled to Canada. The newspaper publisher had used his influence to avoid criminal charges, but had been forced to sell his publications and retreat from public life. Catherine and Elizabeth Lawrence had never been found. Whether they had truly escaped to Germany with Margaret or had died in the mansion fire remained unclear. The bodies recovered from the ruins had been too badly burned for positive identification, and German authorities reported no record of anyone matching their descriptions entering the country. Samuel had suspected that Margaret had killed her surviving daughters before she fled. They had known too much, had been potential witnesses against her, but he could never prove it. The trials concluded in early 1855, and Boston had begun the slow process of recovering from the scandal. But the damage to public trust had been profound. Citizens had learned that their most respected institutions, the courts, the police, the government, could be corrupted by wealth and influence, that horrific crimes could be committed and covered up by those in power. Samuel Whitt had become something of a public figure, praised by reformers as an example of moral courage and vilified by Boston's elite as a troublemaker who had destroyed respected families. His medical practice had suffered. Many of Beacon Hill's wealthy residents had refused to see him, considering him a traitor to his class. But he had gained new patients among merchants, working men, and immigrants who respected what he had done. Sophia Prescott, the young woman whose daughter had been among Margaret's victims, had provided testimony during the trials that had moved many observers to tears. She had described watching her baby taken away, had spoken of her months of wondering what had happened to her child, and had finally learned the truth through Samuel's investigation. The public sympathy she had received had led to a small pension being established for her by the state, an acknowledgement that she had been a victim of crimes the government had failed to prevent. Fletcher had continued his legal work, but he had become increasingly focused on reform efforts, pushing for laws that would make it harder for wealthy individuals to escape justice through corruption and influence. He had drafted legislation requiring multiple physicians to sign off on suspicious death certificates, creating oversight that might have prevented Coroner Danforth's cover-ups. The 3 surviving children, Catherine's son, Elizabeth's daughter, and Anne's son, had been placed with relatives of their biological fathers after extensive legal battles. The Lell family had taken Catherine's boy. The Elbridge family had accepted Elizabeth's daughter, and the Cunningham family had reluctantly agreed to raise Anne's son. These children would grow up knowing nothing of their origins, nothing of the horrific circumstances of their conception, protected by families who had agreed to bury the past completely. The mansion's ruins had been cleared away, and the property had eventually been sold to a textile merchant who had built a new home on the site. But Beacon Hill residents would always remember what had stood there before, and mothers walking past with their children would quicken their pace as though evil might still linger in the very ground. Samuel had received a letter in March 1855 postmarked from Hamburg. It had contained no return address, no signature, only a few lines written in elegant script. Dr. Whitt, you believe you have won, but you have merely delayed the inevitable. The principles I applied remain valid regardless of your small-minded morality. In Germany, I have found colleagues who understand the importance of my work. The experiment continues, and in time, the results will vindicate everything I have done. You saved no one. You merely ensured that progress will occur beyond your reach, beyond your ability to interfere. History will remember me as a pioneer, and you as the man who tried to hold back the tide of human advancement." Samuel had burned the letter, but its words had haunted him. Margaret Lawrence was still out there, still pursuing her grotesque vision, and he was powerless to stop her. He had saved lives in Boston, had exposed a conspiracy, had brought criminals to justice, but the architect of it all had escaped. And somewhere in Europe, she might be continuing her experiments, creating new victims he would never know about. Years later, in 1867, Samuel had received a visit from a German physician named Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, who had been traveling through America studying medical practices. Over dinner, Hartmann had mentioned that he had once encountered a strange case in Hamburg, a wealthy widow who had been operating a private children's home, claiming to be conducting educational experiments on orphans. The authorities had eventually investigated, Hartmann had said, after several children died under mysterious circumstances. The woman had fled before she could be arrested, taking several children with her. Her name had been von Haussmann. If I recall correctly, the case had caused quite a scandal. Samuel's blood had run cold. When did this happen? Around 1858 or 1859, I believe. The woman was never found. Some believed she had gone to America. Samuel had said nothing more on the subject, but he had understood then that Margaret's crimes had not ended with her escape from Boston. She had continued her work in Germany until authorities had closed in, and then she had disappeared again, perhaps returning to America under a new identity, perhaps moving on to some other country where her wealth and intelligence could buy her the freedom to continue. The thought had been deeply disturbing, that Margaret Lawrence might be anywhere, might even be living in America again, conducting her experiments in secret, creating new victims. But Samuel had also known there was nothing he could do about it. He had no authority to investigate crimes in foreign countries, no way to track a woman who had the resources and cunning to disappear completely. What he could do was continue his own work, treating patients with compassion and integrity, training young physicians to value human life above scientific curiosity, and speaking out against the eugenic theories that were gaining popularity in academic circles. The ideas that had driven Margaret Lawrence were not unique to her. They were spreading, being refined, being dressed in increasingly sophisticated scientific language. Samuel had made it his mission to oppose these ideas wherever he encountered them, to argue that human beings could not be reduced to breeding stock, that the value of a life could not be measured by physical perfection or intellectual achievement. In 1870, Samuel had published a book titled The Beacon Hill Tragedy, a physician's account of murder and pseudoscience. The book had detailed everything he had discovered about Margaret Lawrence's crimes. Though he had changed some names to protect the innocent, it had been controversial, with some readers praising his courage and others attacking him for sensationalism. But it had achieved Samuel's primary goal, ensuring that the story would not be forgotten, that future generations would know what had happened when scientific theory was divorced from moral restraint. The book's final chapter had posed a question that Samuel believed every generation would need to answer. How do we balance the pursuit of knowledge with respect for human dignity? How do we prevent the powerful from treating the vulnerable as mere instruments of their ambitions? These are not questions that can be answered once and for all. They must be confronted anew by each generation in each new context where human life is at stake. Samuel Whitt had continued his medical practice in Boston until his death in 1889 at the age of 64. He had never married, had devoted his life entirely to his work and to the reform causes he had championed. His funeral had been attended by hundreds of patients and colleagues, and the eulogy had praised him as a man who had sacrificed personal advancement to stand for what was right. Margaret Lawrence was never conclusively located after her disappearance from Hamburg in 1858. Some historians believe she died in obscurity somewhere in Europe. Others have speculated that she returned to America under an assumed name and continued her work in secret. No definitive evidence has ever been found to resolve the question. The 3 children born from her experiment lived ordinary lives, unaware of their origins. Catherine's son became a banker. Elizabeth's daughter married a minister. And Anne's son became a schoolteacher. None of them showed any signs of the superiority Margaret had tried to engineer, but neither were they in any way inferior to their peers. They were simply people, shaped more by their upbringing and choices than by the genetic manipulation their grandmother had attempted. The Society for Human Advancement was disbanded after the trials, but its ideas did not disappear. The eugenic theories that had motivated Margaret Lawrence would gain renewed influence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, leading to forced sterilization programs, immigration restrictions based on racial theories, and ultimately contributing to some of the greatest atrocities of the modern era. Margaret Lawrence had been a pioneer of these ideas in America, and the fact that she had been stopped in Boston did not prevent others from taking up her work elsewhere. The Beacon Hill Mansion site remained residential property, and over the decades, the memory of what had happened there faded from public consciousness. By the early 20th century, few Bostonians remembered the scandal that had once shocked their city. The story became a footnote in local history books, a strange tale from a darker time. But the questions Margaret Lawrence had raised about human improvement, about the role of science in shaping society, about who has the right to determine which lives are valuable, those questions never disappeared. They remain with us today in different forms, demanding answers that are no easier now than they were in 1854. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors often come not from supernatural forces but from human beings who believe their intelligence gives them the right to treat others as objects of study rather than as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and compassion. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Margaret Lawrence truly escaped justice? Or did her crimes eventually catch up with her? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries. The past has many more dark secrets waiting to be uncovered, and we will continue bringing them to light. See you in the next video.